Well, you may have noticed the insert in the bulletin that invites us to notice what is different in the pictures. One is the original picture, and the other is the original picture with 12 changes. And the game is trying to figure out where the 12 changes are. And some of the changes are really obvious. A bird is facing a different direction. Other changes are much more subtle. A stripe here or the lack of a stripe there. But we have to look closely and carefully to notice any of the changes at all. Now, the letter to the church in Ephesus talked a lot about the changes that took place in a person once they decided to follow Jesus. Ephesus was an interesting place. It was the fourth largest city in the Roman Empire, and it was also the trade center of ancient Rome, which means travelers, ships, caravans from east and west and north and south passed through Ephesus. Now, the city of Ephesus had Artemis as its official god. That meant everyone in the city would make offerings to and say prayers to Artemis, who was the goddess of nature. Worship of an idol did absolutely nothing to change the worshiper's life. The purpose of idol worship was not to have beliefs that changed your character, but rather to keep the god or the goddess from doing any harm in your life. And if your sacrifice was big enough and expensive enough, or your prayers were long enough, well, the purpose was to keep the idol, the god or goddess, from doing harm, and maybe, if you did just enough, the god or the goddess might even give you a touch of good fortune. Beliefs that resulted in life changes, absolutely not part of idol worship at all. That means language, ethics, behaviors, beliefs were not affected or changed by those who worshipped Artemis. And if Ephesus had been located in the United States, we would have referred to it as the Las Vegas of the Roman Empire. Gambling, prostitution, excessive drinking, theft, lying, cheating, and stealing were all expected to take place in Ephesus. So in Ephesus, idol worshippers who chose to follow Jesus experienced a huge difference in their lives. Their belief in Jesus and their desire to imitate him meant a great difference in their behaviors. Idol worshippers in Ephesus were the original picture, and the followers of Jesus were the picture that had changed. Now, change in how we live was and still is one of the major differences between Christians and those who are not. Christianity is based on the belief in Jesus as our Christ and the actions that result from that belief. As Christians, we believe that God is a loving God who wants good things for us. And we believe that we serve God best by imitating Jesus in our thoughts and our words and our actions. And that belief, well, that is bound to change our lives. Well, at least we hope so. The author of the letter to Ephesus clearly did not notice enough changes in the lives of the Christians in Ephesus. The church in Ephesus was a mixture of Jews and Gentiles, and Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians had extraordinarily different ways of looking at the world. Jewish Christians didn't understand why Gentiles refused to follow Jewish laws once they became Christians, and Gentile Christians did not understand why Jewish Christians were so absolutely uptight. Now, eventually, the differences turned into arguments. And arguments turned into fights, and fights turned into resentment. And resentment showed itself in lies, anger, stealing, dishonesty, cussing, and bitterness. Church meetings, well, they were pretty ugly with yelling, accusations, and extreme rudeness. And thankfully, none of us have ever been part of a church meeting like that. Now, chances were the poor behavior they used in church were reflections of the poor behavior Christians in Ephesus used the rest of the time. They wanted to follow Jesus, but little in their behavior had changed. So it was likely that their real beliefs had not changed much either. And without any change in their behavior, it seemed that Jesus was not so much someone to follow as Jesus was an idol to worship. Now, we may find it hard to imagine worshiping an idol. But we all do have idols that we worship to some degree. Now, most of us fool ourselves into believing that we don't have idols because we don't burn incense and we don't offer gifts and we don't intentionally pray to our modern idols. But we do make sacrifices to our idols. Because most of us, in one way or another, worship money. We think of money as freedom. We think of money as our ability to make choices. We think of money as our ability to be content and to be secure. One of our biggest fears in life is running out of money. And money, more often than not, determines our behavior, our mood, and our sense of generosity. Anybody else ever lost sleep over money? Yeah! Most of us, well, we like to worship the idol we call sports. Because most of us would trade Sunday morning worship in a heartbeat for seats on the 50-yard line at a Packer-Cubs game in Lambeau Field. Most of us worship the idol we call security, and we don't count on God for security. We look to our stuff. Our stuff is what makes us feel secure. We all have idols, and idols don't do one single thing that causes us to imitate Jesus. In fact, idols do a lot to draw us away from imitating and living like Jesus. And even with all the idols in our lives, most of us want to believe in Jesus as our Christ. We're just not so sure that we really want to imitate him. We're not sure that we want to give up our self-perceived righteous anger. Bless you. Isn't a fit of righteous anger doesn't that feel good? We know we're right, we know the other person is wrong, and we have the desire to be angry. Yeah, right. We don't want to give up being angry with those who don't see the political world the same way we do. We're not sure we want to give up hating those who are so very different from us, especially when we know they're wrong. We're not sure we always want to be honest, and we're pretty sure we don't always want to work hard just so we can give some of our hard-earned money to others, even when those others have a really good reason. We're really not sure we want to give up cussing and dirty talk. I mean, where's the fun in that? And we're not sure we want to give up telling. We're not sure we always want to tell the truth, especially when telling the truth gets us into trouble. We're not sure we always want to do the right thing. We aren't sure. We want to be recognized as a Christian for anything that we believe, say, think, or do. I mean, we don't want to be those people. Can't we just keep our faith to ourselves? Well, see, here's the problem. When we decide to follow Jesus, we are made into new people by the work of the Holy Spirit, but only if we're willing to let the Holy Spirit go to work on us. The Holy Spirit won't come in and change who we are. It won't transform who we are. It won't give us different desires. It won't change our talk. It won't change our beliefs. It won't change our actions if we don't let it. God does not force God's self upon us. And so we can follow Jesus and refuse to let our belief in his teaching change our behaviors in any way. But when we do that, we succeed in turning Jesus into just one more idol. A really nice idol, but an idol nonetheless. And God, through Jesus, wants to be so much more to us than just another idol we worship. God, through Jesus, wants to use our belief in Jesus and his way of life to change us, to help us to imitate Christ, to help us to be God's people in the world, to help us be the kind of people that others recognize as someone who is good and decent and kind and probably a Christian. Now, if we look back 5 years in our lives, 2013, where were we? What were we doing? If we look back at who we were 5 years ago and cannot see any difference in our behaviors, we're not letting God work on us. We're not letting God change us. If others remember who and how we were 5 years ago and don't see any positive differences now, we're not letting God change us. And if we don't let God go to work on us, if we don't let the Holy Spirit in to transform us, to make us into God's people, we are setting Jesus and his teachings up to just be one more idol. See, as followers of Jesus, we claim that we want to imitate Christ. We want to imitate God, which means letting God change us into the people God has created us to be, which means having an original picture of who we were before we accepted Jesus, before we said, I want to follow you, Jesus, no turning back, and then another picture showing the differences in who we are since we let God go to work in us. There's a before, an original, and then a picture that has some changes. And if we don't have that second picture with some changes, we've just turned Jesus into one more idol. We've just turned the Gospels into one more idol. We've just turned the Bible into one more idol that we put up on the shelf, dust occasionally, put down on the coffee table when we know the pastor's coming. We've just turned it into one more idol. So if we look back and don't recognize any changes in how God has changed us to be more and more like people who imitate God, maybe it's time to take Jesus down off the shelf and let him be more than an idol. Maybe it's time to ask the Holy Spirit to go to work inside of us so that we can be changed by our beliefs, so that we can be changed by following Jesus, so that we can be imitators of Christ. Amen.